So this week's intensity technique is going to be EQIs. So EQI is an acronym for eccentric, quasi-isometric. That is a mouthful, so I'm gonna try and break that down here and make it a little bit easier to digest. So eccentric part, pretty clear. There's going to be some kind of like controlled lowering in here. Quasi-isometric, so we're gonna smash that together. Essentially there, we're just going to try to resist that eccentric. So that's the best way of thinking about it, right? So we are going through the eccentric, trying to resist it as much as possible, fighting against a resistance, and that is essentially taking us from isometric into an eccentric against our will, kind of against our will, but more in a controlled way. So we'll see that here in a second. So there are a few movements that you can do this on, but essentially what we're really trying to force here is not necessarily a hypertrophic response. This is actually more of a mobility technique. And you'll see here in a second whenever I demo it on a pull-up, but this can be done whenever you're taking movements through fuller or more extended ranges of motion than you typically would be able to under normal circumstances. So you can think of like a push-up variation where you're in a deficit. You can think of like a dip. You can think of even something like a stiff leg deadlift in a very controlled fashion, but there are specific movements that are gonna work well for this and specific movements that will definitely not work well, and you'll kind of get a picture of that here in a second. So what we're gonna do is we want to start in a firm, strong position at the mid-range or the top of a movement pattern or that range of motion. So if we're doing a pull-up, for example, we would start at the very top where we're strong, contracted, we can maintain that movement and exert an isometric against it. And then against the external load, we would slowly start to drift into that eccentric all the way through the rep, all the way into full extension, and then we would hold that stretch for a specified amount of time. So essentially, this is just a lot of tension that we're fighting against. But what I'm gonna do here is instead of doing a full pull-up, I'm going to just do the scapular elevation and then through depression. So instead of me pulling myself all the way up there, I'm just going to pull my body up by depressing my scapulae. So what we'll do is we start in that full contracted position or where we're strong, and we just try and hold that. And ideally here, I would probably have some external weight dangling from me to really, really force myself into that extension and into that scapular elevation. But even right now, I can feel myself shaking and I can feel my body weight wanting to pull my shoulder blades up. So I'm still fighting that, but as I get weaker and as my scapular depressors and retractors start to weaken, I naturally just get pulled into that extension. And now my shoulder blades are in full elevation, and I can hold this for as long as I want to, or as long as I can, depending on the movement. So that actually is a sped up version of what an EQI should be. So ideally you want that whole eccentric to be 30 seconds plus long. You're not gonna be able to hold that top position for very long, but that's actually the goal. Again, the isometric is meant to be fighting as hard as you can while the external load is just a bit above that threshold of what you can resist against, and it pulls you into that eccentric. So obviously, it doesn't clearly communicate how difficult this is with me doing it with a scapular depression rather than a really hard movement like a pull-up or a dip or something like that. But these are miserable, they are really brutal, but they are also incredibly effective. So not something that you want to do all the time. Again, like what I said, it's great for mobility. I actually think that this is something that's probably a little bit too intense to be done regularly, but if you're someone who is really trying to open up, let's say your shoulder blades, you're really trying to open up your pecs and your shoulder capsules, this is the type of intensity technique or technique in general that you can really use to force tissue open and force a lot of volume and blood into that muscle. So again, I really want to reiterate, this is definitely not going to be for everyone. This is going to be something that's a bit more advanced for athletes that have very specific needs. But if you can get this down, EQIs are absolutely phenomenal, incredibly intense, incredibly stimulating, and definitely can take training to a little bit higher level.